So welcome everybody. The intent of today's webinar is to share insights about how we're seeing generative AI being used by terrorists, but also to invite Dan Sexton from the Internet Watch Foundation to share his perspectives on the way in which generative AI is being used to generate child sexual abuse material. And the reason for having this combined webinar is because we believe there are a number of common challenges and potentially common solutions. And increasingly, what we're finding is that the use of emerging technology by threat actors online, in some ways, is beginning to demonstrate some similarities. Of course, we appreciate there are many differences as well, but certainly we believe that the more we can collaborate with others addressing other online harms, the stronger our collective response will be. So in terms of offenders and other hostile actors, we are beginning to see, certainly where terrorist content is concerned, increased use of generative AI. In the first place, we're seeing that generative AI is being used to generate propaganda and material, recognizing the fact that often visual spectacle is crucial. There are other use cases as well focused on chatbots, which are somewhat primitive, but successful to an extent. Example there being Gab AI. Where child sexual abuse material is concerned, and Dan will obviously go into a lot more detail about this than I will, there is certainly a trend in which generative AI is being used a significant amount. Not only that, there are other use cases, of course, in terms of how offenders aim to connect with their victims online and to use technologies above and beyond the creation of material. And thirdly, there's increased concern about the use of generative AI with regards to fraud and ransomware and other financial crimes. And certainly the extent to which generative AI is being used by these threat actors is different. And we hope to establish ways in which, as a community, we can pool resources and insights in order to strengthen the collective response. Where content moderation is concerned, we believe there are a number of risks connected to the use of generative AI. The first is where hash sharing, hash matching is concerned. What we're seeing at Tech Against Terrorism is increased use of generative AI to produce very large quantities of manipulated variants of imagery. And the reason this is relevant is that just about manageable to use hash matching on a fairly limited amount of imagery and videos. But if terrorists and other actors are able to make minute changes to these images, in theory, and in some cases in practice, several orders of magnitude greater number of hashes will be needed to be created in order to have the same effect. And that's a concern of ours. The second, kind of connected to this, is content triage. In many cases, hash matching is used to help triage the review of material, and if hash matching becomes less successful as a result of increased volume of material, then the effective triage of this material will be affected. And of course, it's important, certainly where terrorist content is concerned, that the number of false positives are minimized, especially given the risk that political speech not connected to terrorist content is potentially removed by accident. Where detection is concerned, certainly what we're seeing is that generative AI tools can be used and indeed often are used offline. And therefore, as a result of this, it's potentially more difficult to trace the use of these technologies if it's already being used on an isolated offline laptop, for instance. And fourthly, in terms of regulation, clearly regulation is catching up quickly where online harms are concerned. In the EU, in Australia, and in the UK in particular, but other jurisdictions. But the question is this progress fast enough, especially where generative AI is concerned? With regards to chatbots, it's not clear whether chatbots are in scope for the Online Safety Act in the UK, for instance. It may well be, but there is little certainty about whether that is indeed the case. But it's not all bad news. We believe there are a number of ways in which generative AI can itself be used to detect content. In our view, this is potentially an issue of timing. Adversaries are certainly ahead of us in terms of content detection. The question is, how quickly can the industry and others galvanize activity to develop appropriate mechanisms to detect this material? There's also the case that efficiencies in automated detection can provide greater freedom for manual moderation of high-risk material. That's to say, with improved use of algorithmic detection of content, the aspiration will be that human moderators only focus on the most egregious material and therefore improve the quality of overall content moderation decisions. Certainly, small platforms can potentially benefit from this. Historically, the larger platforms have had the funding and engineering capability to use much of this advanced technology. So the question is, with the advent of generative AI and more accessible computer vision technology, to what extent can small platforms benefit from this above and beyond hash matching? What we do know, though, is that many small platforms require enhanced engineering support, and this isn't just where countering terrorist content is concerned, but other online harms. So the question there is, who's going to fund this engineering? And without this funded engineering work, how are these small platforms going to afford to install the technology available? And the point to stress here is that in many cases, the technology is free or inexpensive. The expense comes in the time required to install this technology on those platforms. And finally, we think there's an opportunity where open source classifiers are concerned, potentially creating opportunity for ensemble approaches where platforms can use a multitude of different technologies to detect content at scale.
So the IWF is a UK-based charity, and our role is to find, assess, and remove images and videos of child sexual abuse material from the internet. This has led us to, in the last year or so, AI-generated content. And I think, as Adam says, there are so many common challenges, particularly around image-based abuse with child sexual abuse material. And the work of Tech Against Terrorism and Counterterrorism efforts. And I think very similar both in some of the harms we're seeing and also some of the technical interventions. So I'm just going to give you a bit of background as far as our exposure to this type of content and where it aligns. It is primarily the focus is on the imagery, so it's the use of generative AI to create images. We have seen less, and we have less experience with the language-based use of large language models for chatbots and others. So we have seen some elements of harmful use in that area as well. So we've had our first reports of AI-generated child sexual abuse back in June of last year. So it's nearly coming up to close to a year since we first heard the reports. And we have seen in that period of time, the technology and the progressiveness of the type of content being created change and improve. We, in September, did a study of a single dark web forum, and this is really where a lot of our research has been based, and found 20,000 images that have been created using generative AI, of which 3,000 or so met the threshold for illegality based on UK law. The other 85% or so were still realistic looking images of children that have been created very similar to Adam's examples, offline tools predominantly. So the majority of use we've seen have been open source, generative AI that can be downloaded, it can be manipulated, it can be changed. So if you are creating the software and you put in safeguards to prevent certain prompts or prevent certain outputs, what we saw were these open source tools, very easy to remove those safeguards and remove much more so than it is in the large enterprise services, which are using cloud-based services. And when you make a change to a cloud-based service, it sticks and it's immediate. And you can't, from that point on, a particular dangerous prompt cannot be accepted. The same is not true, unfortunately, the open source software. Once you've created and put it in, you might put that safeguarded in the latest version. The old versions are still there, and because they're open source, you can still remove some of those safeguards from those later versions. And so what we saw certainly early on is both the issues with the pipeline of how you are able to use generative AI to create, in this case, sexual images of children. And there is a series of places to get to that point. So we might see the output and the technical interventions to prevent distribution of that output very similar with other image-based or illegal imagery, the use of hashing and AI classifiers and others to detect content. We see the challenge of the manipulation of media spawning to be less of an issue with child sexual abuse material, if only because there is so much content out there that is freely distributed in poorly regulated or poorly moderated services, that the need to manipulate that imagery to provide detection is less of an issue, particularly as we see an increased move to encrypted services, private messaging. Some of the worst offenders for use of to distribute child sexual abuse material, and again, I think there's a lot of common challenges here with other harm types. Private messaging services like Telegram and others, very popular. They do not scan using hashing for child sexual abuse material. So the need to manipulate content to avoid the detection is only there. It's only a motivator if those detection interventions are widespread and effective. And actually, unfortunately, they're really just not. They are in some places and are not in others. And actually, as we see other services move towards end-to-end encryption for their messaging, they are choosing not to deploy those detection services. And this was very true of the recent decision by Meta to encrypt Facebook Messenger. So they were detecting child sexual abuse content using hashes. In end-to-end encrypted Messenger, they're not. So less of a motivation there to actually manipulate the imagery if no one is doing the detection in the first place. That being said, once the imagery has been created, if it's illegal, the mechanisms to prevent distribution are largely the same as they would be for real content. The issues as we see in the child sexual abuse area is more a case of what safeguarding routines and police responses to those imagery. Those images that are seen by police are valuable in safeguarding real children and identifying real offenders. Manipulated images or AI generated images bring this element of lack of trust. How do you know if you're chasing a real child or a fake one? And that, I think, has some serious concerns for the ability for police to chase down, and it leads to the same issue that the Adams were talking about this concern of a flood. When we were looking at how do you prevent distribution of illegal content, child sexual abuse content, I don't think anybody was thinking that someone would be able to download some software on the internet, run it on their local computer, and create what is effectively an infinite number of new unknown images of child sexual abuse. That is a new harm type that we simply were not prepared for. And I think UK policing and policing globally are also equally concerned about how that will manifest itself in efforts to safeguard real children. The predominantly we've seen is this dark web use of highly technical people who are able to take existing technology and tailor it to all their needs. Some of the comments I've seen from colleagues here is this is a welcoming community. This is a community that is technically capable, that are there to help and skill up people. And actually the ability to take somebody who's not very technical and skill them up to the point where they can create their own content. There is a whole community there that is providing guides and helps to do that, despite how horrendous the content that comes out the other side is. The other new concern, I think this lends itself very much in a similar to disinformation and other types of use of generative AI, is this hybrid technology. So the dark web use of existing offenders creating content is a new method, but it's still the same actors. What we're now seeing in the CSEA space is these nudifying and declothing apps or de-aging apps, which have broken down another barrier by enabling somebody to upload an existing image to an online service that then creates child sexual abuse by de-aging a naked image of a person, or creating a naked image of a child. And the issue there is not, it's the barriers to entry. We're actually starting to see, and there's been some really horrendous news reports about this, about children using these services to create imagery of other children. And that is a very new harm type. And it's a new way the old methods of preventing that from happening don't work. In this case, you're potentially having image-based abuse occurring to a new victim who themselves have never been abused. And that is a new thing that we haven't seen before, and one that going to be very hard to protect against. The other major issue we have, which I think aligns with what Adams has talked about, is how the technical interventions and how do you prevent this from getting any worse. How do you prevent apps being created and distributed which allow this kind of abusive content? It is particularly difficult with child sexual abuse material to do any really robust red teaming. By red teaming, you are trying to make a product do the thing it's not supposed to do. And there are some serious ethical issues and legal issues about tech companies or others trying to break tools to make them create child sexual abuse. By doing so, they are then breaking the law by creating that content. And this is a bind that has not been resolved so far. There are some inference. So if something can create an image of a child and it creates a sexual image of an adult, then the inference, can it create the two together? But actually, the ability to really red team these tools at the moment is really is beyond those that are creating it. There's also looked at the training data. So what is in the training data in the first place? What mechanisms are doing to prevent bad content getting into the data that models are trained on? And if you can get the foundation models to the point where they are not creating or capable of creating harmful content, there is a very difficult issue of fine-tune models. So you might have a completely safe, benign foundation model that is not able to create harmful content, whatever that harmful content might be, but the ability to create smaller models that fine-tune output to look like whatever you want it to look like is much harder. And there are thousands of fine-tune models trained on all types of different content, whether it's to make anime or to make things look like cats or whatever it might be, whatever you can think of, the barriers to creating those models are much lower. So there is this real issue of fine-tuning the bad behavior back into models, even if it doesn't exist in the first place. So I think that we can certainly see there are some challenges between both open and closed source. I think increasingly I'm seeing industry and regulators taking a real interest in this as a new harm type, which I think is good in both areas to ensure that there seems to be more interest and more concern. And I think that's good because we are starting to see some changes taking place. On the closed source, it's definitely easier to start to make those changes sooner, prevent the prompts, clean the training data, positive use of AI and classifiers to look at the output of content to ensure that it's not creating harmful content in itself. The open source models, the content that is on the internet that can be downloaded and the code changed, that is a much more difficult issue. There is a technical barrier there, but what you're sort of seeing is these tools are being downloaded, but then they are being repurposed and put into things like these nudifying apps and other online services, which breaks that barrier down again. So I'm very glad to see this sort of cross-ecosystem response to this, both for you have industry, regulators, governments, law enforcement, civil society groups, and NGOs like IWF Tech Against Terrorism starting to come together on this challenge in a way that really haven't really seen before, perhaps before in other areas. And I think it has caught the public imagination. And I think that's always useful to have that public concern there. I've always, as a technologist myself, I've noticed that the most you see stories about tech have been generally good. So technology is doing a new good thing. There's a new improvement to life. With the AI stories in general, I think we have seen a little bit more concern and a bit more worry, whether it's from the sort of Terminator type scenarios or the very real issues that we are seeing with image-based abuse. People are more worried about this. And I think that's good in some ways because that enables a sort of public support of better regulation, better technical interventions. And the hope is that we're already seeing these harms, but the hope is that with this cross-sector response, we can start to mitigate and reduce any continued harms and to the point where we can start using AI for good and not seeing the harmful content come out.